Serena Mitchell had spent her entire academic life defying expectations. She had stepped into classrooms where professors barely acknowledged her, their assumptions already made. She had seen the silent judgments of her peers, dismissive glances, quiet smirks, before she even had a chance to speak. To them, brilliance had a certain look and she didn't fit the mold. She never argued, never complained. She let their doubts fuel her, proving herself not with words but with undeniable results. But this time she wasn't just proving herself, she was changing the game. Welcome to H2 Black Thread, where we uncover the untold stories of those fighting for the respect they deserve. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And don't forget, subscribe to stay updated because the truth needs a voice. The first time Serena Mitchell stepped into the National Academy of Mathematics in London, she felt the weight of unspoken expectations pressing down on her. She wasn't new to being underestimated. She had seen it before, in the way teachers second-guessed her answers, in the double takes from students when she scored highest on exams, in the subtle surprise in people's voices when they realized she was more than just another student. But this was supposed to be different, a place where only the best of the best were accepted, where students were chosen based on talent alone. At least, that's what the brochure had said. But Serena knew better. From the moment she entered the vast lecture hall, she could feel it, the silent, almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere. Conversations paused for a fraction of a second as she walked past. Students, mostly white, glanced at her before quickly looking away as if they hadn't just been staring. Others whispered behind their hands, their gazes flickering toward her with barely disguised curiosity. It wasn't outright hostility. No one said anything. No one needed to. She had seen this before. The unspoken assumption that she didn't belong here, that she was an anomaly in a place where genius had been historically reserved for a select few. But Serena didn't react. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She adjusted the strap of her bag, lifted her chin slightly, and walked toward an empty seat near the middle. If they thought she would shrink under their scrutiny, they were about to be very disappointed. At precisely 800 a.m., the door at the front of the hall swung open and Professor Jonathan Hayes strode in, heels clicking against the polished floor. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with an air of absolute authority. His neatly pressed suit and silver-framed glasses made him look more like a businessman than a professor. But Serena knew better. He was one of the most feared professors in the entire academy. He had a reputation for being ruthlessly critical, a man who tolerated no nonsense and had no patience for students who couldn't keep up. Students whispered about how he humiliated those who made mistakes, about how he had once made a student cry for miscalculating a theorem in front of the entire class. If you survived Hayes' advanced calculus class, you were almost guaranteed a future in mathematics. If you didn't, well, very few did. The murmurs in the lecture hall died instantly as he walked to the whiteboard, dropping his leather briefcase on the desk with a thud. He picked up a marker and, without preamble, began writing. Laplace transformations. The room filled with the quiet rustle of notebooks opening, pens clicking against pages, laptops booting up. Hayes turned to face the class, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "This class," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "is not for those who are simply good at math." The room remained silent. "If you are here because you enjoy solving equations, congratulations," he continued, his lips curling into a smirk, "but enjoyment won't get you through this course." Serena remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. "This class," he continued, "is about precision, discipline, and the pursuit of perfection. You will either prove you belong here." His gaze swept over the students, lingering only briefly on Serena before moving on. "Or you won't." Hayes turned back to the board and with quick, fluid strokes wrote out an equation that spanned almost the entire length of the whiteboard. "Let's begin," he said. "Who can tell me the next step?" Silence. A few students hesitated, their brows furrowed as they tried to process the problem. Serena's eyes flickered across the equation, recognizing the mistake almost immediately. It was small, a misplaced coefficient in the second transformation step, but it changed the entire outcome. She glanced around. No one else had noticed. A student in the front row, a slim young man with neatly combed blonde hair, hesitantly raised his hand. "Sir, I think the next step would be to apply the derivative property here," he said, pointing at the equation. Hayes glanced at him, expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. The boy paled slightly and lowered his hand. A few students smirked. Hayes turned back to the board. Anyone else? Still, no one spoke. Serena hesitated for only a second before raising her hand. The movement wasn't dramatic. She didn't wave her hand eagerly. She simply lifted it, calm and steady, and yet somehow the entire room seemed to notice. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Serena lowered her hand, her voice clear and measured. "The coefficient in the second transformation is incorrect," she said. "If you carry it over that way, the integral limits change, and the final answer won't match the expected result." A ripple of murmurs spread through the lecture hall. Hayes froze for half a second, so brief that most wouldn't have noticed. But Serena did. Then he slowly turned back to the board, scanning the equation, and there it was. The mistake. His mistake. His grip tightened on the marker for just a fraction of a second. Then, with an air of forced nonchalance, he capped it, turned back to the class, and nodded. "Good observation," he said coolly. "Let's correct that." He erased the mistake and rewrote the equation without looking at her once. For the rest of the lecture, Serena kept her head down, scribbling notes while Hayes continued his lesson. But the shift had already happened. Students were stealing glances at her, whispering in low voices. Some were impressed, some were irritated, and Hayes, he didn't look at her again. But she could feel it, the tightness in his posture, the way his voice was just a bit sharper than before. She had embarrassed him, and he wasn't the kind of man to let that go. As the lecture ended, students filed out quickly, their voices rising as they exited. Serena packed her things, ready to leave, when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Mitchell." She turned. Hayes stood by his desk, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "Stay for a moment," he said, voice unreadable. Serena met his gaze, her expression perfectly composed. She nodded. "Of course." And with that, the game had begun. The next morning, Serena Mitchell walked into the lecture hall with the same measured confidence as before, but she knew things had changed. She had challenged Professor Hayes' authority, not directly, not aggressively, but enough that he noticed. Enough that the entire class noticed. Now, the question wasn't whether Hayes had made a mistake. It was how he was going to respond to it. And Serena had a feeling he wasn't about to let it go. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it, the subtle shift, the whispers that weren't there yesterday, the way students glanced at her, some with curiosity, some with irritation. She ignored it. She took her seat and opened her notebook. The lecture was about to begin. At precisely 800 a.m., the door swung open and Professor Jonathan Hayes strode in, just as he had the day before. But today, his gaze didn't sweep over the room. It went directly to her, for just a second. Then, as if the moment had never happened, he turned back to the whiteboard and picked up his marker. "This morning," he said smoothly, "we continue with Laplace transforms." His voice was even, controlled, but Serena knew better. This wasn't just a lecture. This was a test. Hayes moved quickly through the material, covering advanced transformation techniques, pushing the pace faster than the day before. A few students struggled to keep up, flipping through their notes in frustration. Then, without warning, he turned to the board and began writing an equation. It was long. much longer than necessary. Serena's eyes flicked across the symbols. Something about it felt off. The equation seemed deliberately messy, overly complicated for no reason. And then she realized this wasn't just a problem. It was a setup. Hayes capped his marker, turned back to the class, and said, "Miss Mitchell." A few students looked up sharply. Serena slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "Yes, sir." Hayes gestured toward the board. "Since you seem to have a sharp eye for detail," he said smoothly, "why don't you solve this for the class?" Serena's fingers tightened slightly around her pen. There it was, the challenge, the test of authority. This wasn't about math anymore. This was about power. Serena stood, not rushed, not hesitant, just calm and deliberate. She walked to the board, her footsteps the only sound in the massive lecture hall. She picked up the marker and examined the equation, and just as she had suspected, it was deliberately misleading. The steps were out of order. The variables were manipulated unnecessarily. The equation was made to be confusing, not to test knowledge but to create failure. Hayes was watching her, arms crossed. Serena took a slow breath. She could do one of two things: solve it exactly as written, no matter how convoluted it was; call out the flaw, proving that Hayes had deliberately constructed it to be misleading. She didn't hesitate. She chose option 2. "The problem is incorrect," she said simply. A hush fell over the room. Serena could hear the tension shift. Students glanced at each other, as if questioning whether she had just made a huge mistake. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." Serena turned to face him fully. "There's a fundamental flaw in the equation," she said. "You added an extra transformation that serves no purpose except to complicate the solution. If I solve this as written, I'd have to backtrack multiple times." The room was silent. Hayes tilted his head slightly, but his expression didn't change. "Then by all means," he said, voice smooth, "feel free to correct it." Serena nodded once. She lifted the marker and without hesitation began erasing parts of the equation. Murmurs spread through the class. She wasn't just solving the problem. She was rewriting it, and Hayes was letting her. Serena rewrote the equation step by step, eliminating the unnecessary complications. She could feel the eyes on her. The same students who had doubted her yesterday were now holding their breath, watching. She finished the last step, boxed the final answer, and set the marker down. Then she turned to face Hayes. For the first time all morning he hesitated, only for half a second, but Serena saw it. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly. "Well," he said finally, "that is one way to do it." A few students exhaled sharply. They had expected him to shut her down. Serena simply nodded and returned to her seat. For the rest of the lecture, Hayes didn't call on her again. He moved on, continuing as if the moment had never happened, but it had, and the entire class felt it. There was a shift now, a subtle but undeniable change in how students looked at her. They had expected Hayes to prove his dominance. Instead, Serena had flipped the script. Not by arguing, not by backing down, but by being undeniably right, and Hayes knew it. When class ended, Serena packed up her books, ready to leave. She had just slung her bag over her shoulder when she heard his voice. "Miss Mitchell." She stopped, turned. Hayes was standing by his desk, watching her. His posture was calm, but his eyes told a different story. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You're an intelligent student." Serena's expression remained neutral. "But," he continued, stepping forward slightly, "intelligence without discipline can be reckless." Serena tilted her head slightly. "Are you suggesting I was reckless, sir?" Hayes gave a small, knowing smirk. "I'm suggesting that arrogance can be a dangerous thing," he said smoothly, "even in students as talented as yourself." There it was, the warning, the subtle reminder that he was still in control. Serena held his gaze for a moment longer, then she smiled. "I agree," she said evenly. And with that, she turned and walked out of the lecture hall. Hayes watched her go, his expression unchanging. But in his mind, one thought was clear. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a problem, and problems needed to be solved. Serena knew Professor Hayes wasn't done with her. She had seen it in his eyes the day before, the way he had issued his subtle warning, the way his polite smirk never quite reached his eyes. She had humiliated him, even if unintentionally. And men like Hayes, they didn't take humiliation lightly. The morning sun poured through the wide glass windows of the lecture hall as students filed in, chatting in low voices. But when Serena walked in, conversations quieted slightly. Some students shot quick glances her way, while others tried not to be obvious about their curiosity. The dynamic had shifted again. It wasn't just that she had corrected Hayes. It was the way she had done it so effortlessly. She had rewritten his equation, fixed his mistake, and walked away with her dignity intact. And Hayes had let her. For now, she slid into her seat, placed her notebook on the desk, and waited. At precisely 800 a.m., the door swung open. Professor Hayes entered, carrying nothing but a single sheet of paper. No books, no bag, not even his usual notes, just one single piece of paper. Serena's fingers instinctively tightened around her pen. This was it. Without a word, Hayes walked up to the whiteboard. The silence was heavier than usual. He didn't greet the class. He didn't set up the lesson. He just uncapped a marker and began writing. Serena's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him work. Equation after equation sprawled across the board, longer, denser, more complex than anything he had assigned so far. She could hear the rustle of notebooks opening, the soft murmurs of students whispering. Even the strongest students in the class were staring at the board in confusion. It was too much, too complicated, too deliberately difficult. When he finally stepped back, Hayes capped the marker with precise, controlled movements. Then, at last, he turned to the class. "This," he said smoothly, "is the most advanced problem you will face this semester." The class shifted uncomfortably. Some students were already flipping through their notes, hoping for a lifeline, but Serena just watched him. "This problem," Hayes continued, "has never been solved in this class before." The murmurs grew louder. A problem never solved before. That wasn't a lesson. That was a statement. Hayes let the tension build for a moment. Then he spoke again. "And since Miss Mitchell has proven to be particularly eager to demonstrate her abilities," his gaze locked onto Serena's, "why don't we let her take the first attempt?" A hush fell over the room. Serena felt every pair of eyes turn to her. Some students were smirking as if expecting her to finally fail. Others just looked curious. Hayes was testing her, not just her intelligence, not just her ability to solve problems. Her confidence, her composure, her willingness to stand her ground, she could feel it. The challenge wasn't just the math, it was the psychological game behind it. If she refused, she'd look afraid. If she tried and failed, she'd prove that Hayes was right to doubt her. But if she solved it, that would be a different story. Serena set down her pen, pushed her chair back, and stood. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the front of the room with the same steady confidence as before. The whispers died down. Even the students who wanted her to fail were silent now. She picked up the marker, took a slow breath, and examined the equation. It was a mess of integrals, summations, and complex transformations. But beneath it all, she could see it. The pattern. The shortcut that wasn't obvious to anyone else. Most students would have spent the next 10 minutes just staring at the problem, trying to figure out where to begin. Serena didn't. She knew what Hayes wanted. He wanted her to panic. He wanted her to stumble. But instead, she lifted the marker and started writing. She didn't waste time. She didn't second-guess herself. She just solved. The moment the first equation hit the board, a few students leaned forward in their seats. Some were intrigued, some were skeptical, but none of them spoke. Hayes, still standing near his desk, folded his arms. His eyes flicked between her and the board. Serena kept going. She moved quickly but not recklessly. Every step flowed logically into the next. Every transformation simplified the problem piece by piece. She was doing something different, something unexpected. Instead of tackling the problem the way Hayes had designed it, she was cutting straight through the mess. She was rewriting the entire approach, and Hayes noticed. His jaw tensed slightly. Serena saw it out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't stop. She kept going, step by step, number by number. Until finally she underlined the final answer and stepped back. The room was silent, completely, utterly silent. Hayes stared at the board. His expression didn't change, not right away. He walked toward the problem, slowly, deliberately, and scanned her work. The class held its breath. Then, without a word, he turned, walked back to his desk, and picked up his briefcase. Serena narrowed her eyes slightly. Was that it? No response, no comment. Hayes glanced at her, then at the class, and finally said, "Well." He exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers once against the desk. "It seems," he said carefully, "that Miss Mitchell has found a more efficient approach." A few students exchanged glances. More efficient. She had just solved a problem no one else had ever solved before, and that was all he had to say. Hayes turned back to the class. "I suggest you all take note," he continued. The smirk was back on his face now, but it wasn't as confident as before. "There is always more than one way to solve a problem." He didn't say she was right. But he also didn't say she was wrong. And Serena, she didn't need his validation. She knew exactly what had happened. She had just beaten him at his own game. And Hayes, he knew it too. As students filed out of the classroom, Serena could feel it. The looks, the murmurs. Some students nodded at her in silent respect. Others seemed almost frustrated, as if she had disrupted something they weren't ready to accept. And Hayes, he stood by his desk, watching her as she gathered her things. For a moment it was just the two of them. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Mitchell." Serena glanced at him, her face unreadable. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She already knew he wasn't going to let this go, and the next test would be even harder. She smiled slightly. "Then I guess I better keep winning." And with that she walked out. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Serena Mitchell had expected resistance. She had expected Professor Hayes to challenge her intellect, undermine her confidence, and test her limits. What she hadn't expected was how fast everything had changed. She wasn't just another student anymore. She was the student everyone was watching, and Hayes knew it. When Serena walked into the lecture hall that morning, she felt the difference immediately. The usual low murmur of conversation quieted slightly. Some students whispered to each other, glancing at her out of the corner of their eyes. Others pretended not to notice her at all, but their avoidance was just as loud as their curiosity. It wasn't just that she had solved the impossible problem. It was how she had done it. She hadn't just followed the rules. She had rewritten them, and that was something people remembered. At 800 a.m. sharp, the door swung open. Professor Hayes strode in, carrying a single stack of papers. Serena immediately knew something was different. No briefcase, no extra materials, just one stack of papers. He walked straight to the desk and placed them down with precise, deliberate movements. Then he turned to face the class. "Today," he said smoothly, "we are going to do something different." The tension in the room thickened. Hayes wasn't just here to lecture. He was here to make a statement. He let his gaze sweep across the room before continuing. "Many of you," he said, "have heard about last class." Serena kept her face neutral. She knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just talking about the problem, he was talking about her. "Which is why," Hayes continued, his voice laced with something sharp, "I've decided that today's lesson will be a bit more interactive." He gestured toward the stack of papers. "We will be conducting a timed mathematics assessment," he said. A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the room. An assessment? Now, Serena's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't just about testing the class. This was about testing her, and Hayes wasn't even hiding it. "Before we begin," Hayes said, "let's make this more interesting." He turned to Serena, his expression perfectly controlled. "Miss Mitchell." A few students exchanged glances. "Here it comes." Serena met his gaze, her posture relaxed. "Yes, sir." Hayes picked up a single paper from the stack and held it up. "Since you seem to have a particular talent for problem solving," he said, "why don't you complete your test?" He let the words hang for a moment. "On the board." The room went silent. Some students looked excited, others looked concerned. Serena just watched him. She could feel it. This wasn't just about proving herself. This was about publicly testing her confidence. If she hesitated, if she faltered even slightly, that was all the opening Hayes needed. She had two choices: refuse and let him win, accept and prove that she wasn't intimidated. She didn't hesitate. "All right." Serena stood, walked to the front, and took the paper from Hayes' hand. She could feel the weight of the entire room on her. This was a game to him, a test of dominance. But Serena, she wasn't here to play. She was here to win. She picked up the marker, took a slow breath, and started writing. At first, the room was completely silent except for the sound of the marker against the board. Serena's movements were calm and precise. Step by step, she worked through the problem, her handwriting flowing across the surface in clean, deliberate lines. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hesitating. She was in control. Murmurs began to rise in the classroom as students watched her work. "She's already halfway done. She's not even pausing. This is insane." Professor Hayes remained still, his arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. But Serena saw it. The way his jaw tightened slightly. The way his fingers curled against his sleeve. She was faster than he had expected. She was more precise than he had planned, and she was not struggling. She kept going. And then she boxed the final answer, stepped back, and set the marker down. The room was dead silent. Serena turned to face Hayes. His eyes flicked across the board, checking for errors, checking for any excuse to dismiss her, but there were none. She had solved it perfectly. A few students exhaled sharply, realizing what had just happened. Hayes' fingers tapped against his sleeve once. Then, finally, he nodded. "Well," he said. His voice was measured, but Serena could hear it, the forced neutrality, the tension beneath the words. "It appears Miss Mitchell has completed her work," he said. No praise, no acknowledgement, just a flat statement. But Serena didn't need it. She had already won. Serena returned to her seat, her head held high. Students were looking at her differently now, some with respect, some with discomfort. But no one, not even Hayes, could pretend she hadn't earned her place. And that was the real victory. For the rest of the lecture, Hayes continued as if nothing had happened. But Serena knew better. She had done something that couldn't be undone. She had proven that she was his intellectual equal, and Hayes, for the first time, he was starting to realize something dangerous. He wasn't just facing a student. He was facing a challenge he couldn't control. And that changed everything. At the end of the lecture, as students packed up their things, Serena slung her bag over her shoulder and stood. She was about to leave when she felt a presence beside her, Hayes, standing close enough that only she could hear. "You're making waves, Miss Mitchell." His voice was smooth, controlled. Serena looked up at him. And his lips curled into a small, unreadable smirk. "Be careful," he said softly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Serena stood there for a moment, considering his words. Then she smiled, because she knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't warning her. He was acknowledging her, and that was the biggest victory yet. Serena Mitchell should have seen it coming. Professor Hayes had tested her intelligence. He had tested her composure. He had tested her ability to handle pressure, and she had won every time. But Hayes wasn't done with her yet. This time, the challenge wasn't just in the classroom. This time, he was going to push her to the limit. The tension in the lecture hall was heavier than usual when Serena walked in that morning. Students had already heard the rumors. Something big was happening. Professor Hayes stood at the front, arms crossed, a calm but knowing expression on his face. As soon as the clock hit 800 a.m., he spoke. "As many of you know," he began, "the university will be selecting a student to compete in the National Mathematics Symposium." A ripple of murmurs spread through the class. The National Mathematics Symposium was the most prestigious competition in the country. Only one student from their university would be chosen, and that student would be competing against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. Serena stiffened slightly. She had a feeling she knew exactly where this was going. Professor Hayes let the murmurs settle before continuing. "This year," he said, "I've decided that we will determine our representative through a live problem-solving challenge." His eyes scanned the room deliberately before settling on her. "A challenge," he added smoothly, "between our two strongest candidates." The room went silent. Everyone knew what that meant: Serena and Nathan Caldwell. Serena had never spoken much to Nathan Caldwell. He was tall, sharp-featured, and carried himself with an easy, effortless confidence. He was the kind of student who never had to prove himself, because people already assumed he was the best. Nathan wasn't just a top student, he was the top student. He had held the highest math scores at the university for the past 2 years, and until Serena had arrived, no one had ever challenged him. Now, that was about to change. "The competition will be simple," Hayes continued. "There will be 3 rounds. Round 1, speed, solving the first to complete a complex problem correctly wins. Round 2, proof construction, the student who provides the most elegant proof wins. Round 3, mental mathematics, no writing, no calculators, just pure computation. The winner," Hayes concluded, "will represent our university at the National Mathematics Symposium." His gaze flickered toward Serena just briefly. She understood the message clearly. This was his final test, his last chance to prove that she wasn't as exceptional as she seemed. Serena set her jaw. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The challenge took place in the largest lecture hall on campus. Students packed into the seats, eager to watch the biggest intellectual showdown of the year. Nathan stood on one side of the whiteboard. Serena stood on the other. Professor Hayes stood in the middle, holding a sealed envelope. "This problem," he said, "was designed by 3 of the top mathematicians in the country." He pulled out the problem, clipped it to the board, and stepped back. "You may begin." The moment the timer started, Serena's mind exploded into motion. The problem was insanely complicated. Layers of derivatives, multiple transformations, integrals within summations. It was a brutal test of speed and precision. She could hear Nathan's marker flying across the board. He was fast, faster than she had expected. But she was faster. She could see the pattern, the shortcut no one else saw, the way to simplify everything in a fraction of the time. She barely noticed the crowd leaning forward in their seats, barely heard the murmurs of students whispering. Her focus was absolute. And then she boxed her final answer and stepped back. Nathan was still writing. The room erupted. Professor Hayes walked over, scanned her answer, then turned to Nathan. "You can stop." Nathan froze. He turned, blinking as if he couldn't believe it. Serena had finished first, and her answer, it was perfect. She had won round 1. Nathan was angry now. Serena could see it in his posture. He hadn't expected a real challenge, but that didn't mean he was giving up. For round 2, they were given an abstract theorem and asked to construct the most elegant proof possible. This wasn't about speed. This was about brilliance, and Nathan, he was a genius at proof building. Serena worked methodically, breaking the problem down into clean, logical steps. But Nathan, his solution was beautiful, elegant, undeniable. When they both stepped back, Hayes examined their work and announced the winner. Nathan Caldwell takes round 2. Serena nodded once. It was fair. Now it all came down to round 3. The rules were simple. Professor Hayes would read a series of problems aloud. No writing, no calculators, just pure mental mathematics. The first to say the correct answer wins the point. First to 3 points wins the round. Nathan cracked his knuckles. Serena exhaled slowly. She was ready. First problem, evaluate 462 times 38 in your head. Nathan answered first. Correct. Second problem, what is the cube root of 35,937? Serena answered. Correct. Third problem, find the sum of all prime numbers under 50. Serena answered. Correct. The crowd was holding its breath. Nathan had 1 point. Serena had 2. One more point, and she won everything. Hayes glanced at both of them before reading the final problem. What is the determinant of the following 3x3 matrix? He read the numbers. Serena's brain worked instantly. The trick was not solving the determinant outright, it was recognizing the hidden pattern. Nathan started calculating. But Serena, she already knew the answer. She spoke first. The answer left her lips before Nathan could even finish computing, and it was correct. The room exploded into applause. She had won. She had just defeated the university's top student, and more importantly, she had proven once and for all that she belonged here. Nathan walked over and extended his hand. For a moment, Serena thought he might say something smug, but instead, he just nodded. That was impressive. Serena shook his hand. Thanks. She could see it in his eyes. He respected her now. Even if he didn't like losing, he couldn't deny the truth. Serena Mitchell was the real deal, and Hayes. He stood at his desk, watching silently. For the first time, he had nothing to say, because there was nothing left to prove. Serena had won, and the shift in power was now complete. Serena Mitchell had won the battle, but now, she had to win the war. The National Mathematics Symposium wasn't just a competition, it was the proving ground. A place where only the best minds in the country went head to head. And after everything she had fought through, she wasn't about to let this moment slip away. This wasn't just about winning a contest. This was about proving once and for all where she truly belonged. The symposium hall at Princeton University was massive. Rows of seats filled with professors, researchers, and students from the top universities in the country. A stage sat at the center, where a massive digital board loomed over the audience. On that stage, the finalists, and among them Serena Mitchell. She adjusted her blazer, steadying her breath. This was it. The culmination of everything she had fought for, and standing just a few feet away, Nathan Caldwell, her former rival, now her only real competition, and seated in the audience watching with careful intensity, Professor Jonathan Hayes. The National Mathematics Symposium was legendary for its brutal final round. The challenge, mathematical combat. A one-on-one battle, where competitors were given a series of complex problems in real time. The first to 5 correct answers wins. But there was a twist. Each problem came with a trap, a hidden layer of complexity designed to test more than just intelligence. It tested pattern recognition, strategy, and mental agility. It wasn't just about who was smarter. It was about who could think faster, sharper, and more efficiently under pressure. Serena clenched her fists. This wasn't just a competition anymore. This was a final checkmate. The first problem flashed across the digital board. It was a multi-variable limit problem requiring deep calculus intuition. Serena's brain locked in immediately. Nathan was fast, but Serena was faster. Her hand shot up just seconds before his. Answer, the moderator asked. Serena's voice was steady. She gave her answer without hesitation. The screen flashed green, correct. She had drawn first blood. Nathan wasn't going down easy. The next problem was a high-level combinatorics puzzle designed to test advanced probability theory. Nathan's strategy was clear. He wasn't going to rush. Instead, he let Serena solve first, then double-checked before responding. This time, his answer was flawless. The screen flashed green. Nathan won, Serena won. The audience murmured in excitement. This was going to be a battle to the very end. The third problem appeared, and this time, it was designed to trip them up. It wasn't just complex, it was deceptively simple. A problem that looked easy but carried a hidden trick. Serena could feel the trap. Nathan, he jumped at it too quickly. He raised his hand first, gave his answer. The screen flashed red. Incorrect. A gasp went through the crowd. Serena exhaled, double-checked her reasoning, then gave her answer. Correct. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly. He had just made a critical mistake. And Serena, she had just taken the lead again. The next problem flashed instantly. This one wasn't about strategy, it was about pure speed. Serena and Nathan's markers flew across their boards, solving simultaneously. It was a race to the finish line. And this time, Nathan got there first. The screen flashed green. Tie game 2-2. Serena wiped the sweat from her palm. She couldn't afford another second-place answer. Not now. The fifth problem appeared, and this time, the audience gasped audibly. This problem wasn't just difficult, it was legendary. A problem that had stumped mathematicians for decades. It had never been fully solved. Nathan let out a quiet breath beside her. For the first time, even he looked nervous. Serena stared at the equation. She knew what Hayes was thinking in the audience. He believed this was the end of the road. But Serena, she wasn't here to play it safe. She was here to win. She rolled back her shoulders, picked up the marker, and started writing. Nathan was calculating carefully, step by step. Serena, she was looking at the problem differently. She wasn't solving it, she was breaking it down. Looking for the hidden pattern, the shortcut that no one had ever seen before, and then she found it. Nathan was still crunching numbers when Serena's hand shot into the air. The audience froze. Had she actually solved it? The moderator blinked. Serena, she gave her answer in one breath. The room went dead silent. A pause. Then the screen flashed green. Correct. The audience erupted into absolute chaos. Nathan whipped his head toward her, eyes wide. She had just done the impossible. Serena barely registered the noise. Her mind was still running through the numbers. She wasn't even thinking about the competition anymore. She was thinking about the problem itself. Because she hadn't just solved it, she had just discovered something new. When the challenge ended, Serena walked off the stage, still catching her breath. Nathan caught up to her. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, "You were incredible." Serena blinked. Nathan Caldwell, the student who never lost, was actually admitting defeat. She offered him a small smile. "You weren't so bad yourself." Nathan let out a soft chuckle and shook his head. "You know what you did back there wasn't just a win, right?" he said. "That problem, no one has ever solved it before." Serena hesitated. She knew. And so did everyone else. But before she could respond, a slow clap echoed through the air. Serena turned. Professor Hayes stood at the edge of the room, watching her with an unreadable expression. For the first time, there was no challenge in his eyes, just acknowledgement. Serena met his gaze, and in that moment she knew. She hadn't just beaten him. She had changed his entire perception of her. She had won more than just a competition. She had forced the world to recognize her brilliance. And nothing would ever be the same again. Serena Mitchell had spent years fighting for a place at the table. She had spent months battling Professor Hayes, proving herself in every challenge he threw her way. And she had spent hours on that stage, solving problems that had stumped even the greatest minds. But now the world had no choice but to acknowledge her. This wasn't just a victory. This was a moment of reckoning. The aftermath of Serena's win at the National Mathematics Symposium rippled through the academic world like a shockwave. Within hours, social media exploded with clips of the final round. By the next morning, her name was trending in mathematical and academic circles. University student breaks record in National Math Symposium. Mathematical prodigy Serena Mitchell stuns the academic world. The impossible problem finally solved, professors, researchers, even journalists. They were all talking about her. But one reaction mattered more than the rest, the one that came from Professor Jonathan Hayes. Serena walked into class that Monday morning with the weight of the world on her shoulders, not because she felt burdened, but because she knew everything had changed. The moment she entered the lecture hall, students turned to look at her. Not with the usual skepticism, not with quiet judgment, but with respect. And Hayes, he was already standing at the front flipping through his notes. The second their eyes met, Serena knew something was different. For the first time, Hayes wasn't testing her. For the first time, she wasn't just a student in his class. She was his intellectual equal, and he finally knew it. When the clock hit 800 a.m., Hayes did something that shocked everyone. He put his notes down, stepped away from the podium, and looked directly at Serena. "Before we begin today's lecture," he said, his voice calm, "there's something that needs to be acknowledged." The class fell silent. Not a single student moved. Hayes never made announcements, never paused a lecture for anything personal. But now, he was stopping everything for Serena. Hayes crossed his arms, glancing briefly at the students before returning his gaze to her. "As many of you are aware," he continued, "Miss Mitchell recently represented our university at the National Mathematics Symposium." A few students nodded, some already smiling. "She didn't just compete," he said, "she won." A ripple of murmurs spread through the class. Some students exchanged glances. Others sat up straighter. Hayes wasn't done. "And in doing so," he said, his voice level, "she solved a problem that had remained unsolved for decades." Serena felt her heart pound. She wasn't sure where this was going. Then Hayes exhaled slowly. He turned fully toward her, and for the first time in her life, Serena heard words she never thought would come from his mouth. "Congratulations, Miss Mitchell," he said. "You've set a new standard for all of us." If the room had been quiet before now, it was dead silent, not because people didn't believe it, but because Hayes had just done something no one expected. He had publicly acknowledged her as an equal. He had publicly admitted she had achieved something greater than him. For months he had tested her. For months he had challenged her. And now, he had just given her the recognition she deserved. The silence didn't last long. Students began clapping, first a few, then more, then the entire room. Serena blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't just about winning the competition anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about finally being seen. After class, as students filed out, Serena packed up her things slowly. She could feel Hayes watching her. Sure enough, when the last student left, he finally spoke. "Miss Mitchell." Serena turned. Hayes wasn't standing behind the desk anymore. He had moved closer, leaning against the whiteboard. For the first time, there was no tension between them, no silent battle for dominance, just understanding. "You saw something in that final problem that no one else did," Hayes said. Serena tilted her head. "That's my job, isn't it?" she said, half smiling. Hayes let out a short breath, something that almost sounded like a chuckle. "I suppose it is," he admitted. Then his expression shifted. "Listen," he said, "I wasn't easy on you, I know that." Serena's smile faded slightly. She nodded. "But you proved something that most people never get the chance to prove." He paused. "Then, you didn't just earn my respect." He met her gaze. "You demanded it." Serena felt something deep in her chest tighten. She had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was real. As she walked out of the lecture hall, Serena felt lighter. The fight was over. But this was just the beginning, because now she wasn't just fighting to prove herself. She was paving the way for the next student like her. The next student who would walk into a room like this one and be underestimated. The next student who would refuse to back down. The next student who would stand their ground and change everything. Serena smiled to herself. She wasn't just recognized now. She was respected. And that was the greatest victory of all.